I turned to observe what my son was looking at. Seeing nothing, I asked him what was wrong. He slowly raised his finger, pointing towards the patio door. It was lying. He tried to speak, but couldn't. I said to him, "There's nothing there," at which point his face dropped even more. His voice was shaking as he said, through tears of sheer terror, "It's gone upstairs." Watch until the end of this video to find out exactly what that boy was seeing. Now, let's get on with the stories. I'm your host, Severed Soul. I'm a female. I'm 34 years old, and this is my story. Around 2006, my cousin moved into an apartment with her new husband. It was only a few blocks away from where I lived with my mother at the time. My cousin went on to have a baby whilst living in that apartment, and the baby was born with health difficulties. It turns out he's on the spectrum and is also non-verbal. In 2014, I was looking for a place to buy, and my cousin offered me her apartment. They wanted to have another child, and the apartment was just too small. She made me an offer that turned out to be really good for the both of us. So much so that I was able to pay the apartment off directly to her within a year. I moved into the apartment in the middle of 2015. I decorated the place with a mix of new and thrifted furniture. I had a specific look I was going for. For my bedroom, I had a century-old wardrobe professionally renovated. It was a gorgeous piece of furniture. Everything was fine for a while, but then, in 2016, I started to suffer from sleep paralysis. I would never see any demons, like some people do, but nevertheless, it was a terrifying experience. I also experienced lucid dreaming without ever trying to achieve it. It just happened. Then, in 2017, I started hearing noises in the apartment at night. Now, here's the thing. I have 3 cats, so most noises at night don't scare me in the slightest. I always just presume it's one of the cats acting up. But the noise I was hearing was very specific. It came from the corner of the room where that wardrobe was. It sounded just like somebody was snoring or breathing heavily while sleeping. I tried my best to rationalise this, but I just couldn't explain that noise. Some nights it would bother me so much that I'd actually get up and look around for the source of the noise. It really felt and sounded like somebody was asleep in that room with me. For context, I've had the same neighbours in that apartment for many years now, so it couldn't be that suddenly I can hear into their bedroom, although I did consider every possibility. I was absolutely certain that somehow that wardrobe was to blame. Maybe it had brought something or someone with it. So I made the decision to dismantle the wardrobe and I got rid of it. All except for the base. I decided to DIY it into a little sofa. I stopped hearing that noise at night, and so I was really pleased. A few weird things would happen every now and then, like objects would still move on their own, or break inexplicably. In 2019, I got another new cat. She was a tiny kitten, and I called her Gigi. All my cats were indoor cats. They always had been, and Gigi was no exception. She had never had a life outside of my apartment. It was all she ever knew, and yet she was extremely skittish. Everything seemed to scare her. She would spend most of her days hiding behind things. To this day, I still find it really hard to explain her behaviour. I guess some cats are just naturally very anxious. Nothing weird happened in the apartment in 2020 or 2021, which was good because I was isolated in the apartment by myself most of the time. Even Gigi was a little less nervous. Perhaps this was because there were no people coming and going. In 2022, I moved to another country for work, and one of my other cousins came to stay at the apartment to look after the cats. Eventually, her son moved in too, because the apartment was close to his university, so he was living there by himself for a while. One day, he told his mum that he heard a weird noise in the bedroom at night. He said it sounded just like somebody was snoring in the bedroom right next to him. His girlfriend said she could never hear a thing when she came to stay over, but he was adamant that he could hear it most nights. Sometime later, he went to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, and he swears he could see a figure standing there. He said it was a woman with a really creepy smile on her face. He pretended he hadn't seen her and went back to bed. I honestly have no idea how he didn't run for his life. That is the first thing I would have done. Around the same time, Gigi started acting even more weird than usual. She would try hiding in high places, and by doing that, she would knock things over and end up breaking things. She knocked over mirrors, picture frames, and even shelving units. My cousin's son would often find her hiding in strange places in the morning, like on top of kitchen units. These were pretty high and hard to get to, even for a cat. But she seemed determined to hide, or even escape, from something. In late 2023, I went back to my hometown to empty the apartment. I stayed there by myself with the cats for several weeks whilst packing up. One night, I dreamt that I was in bed, just as I was in real life, and I was lying on my side, FaceTiming my boyfriend. We had our cameras on, and at one point, as I looked into my own image on the screen, I could see a woman behind me. I turned around as quickly as possible, and there she was right above me. I had a weird thought like, there you are, I'm gonna get you. So, I grabbed the woman around her neck with all my strength. I knocked her off me and she fell to the floor. Then, she disappeared and I woke up. It felt real, in a weird kind of way, like I was really proud of myself, and I hoped that she got the message. I went on with my day, feeling pretty good, and at night time, I was on my own again. I was feeling a little uneasy, so I decided to close the bedroom door and sleep on the couch in the living room. Suddenly, I heard the loudest, craziest noise coming from the bedroom. It sounded like 1,000 pots and pans had just fallen off the shelves. It was insanely loud. My cats jumped off me and hid. I walked to the bedroom, absolutely convinced that something must have fallen off the one shelf left on the wall. But no. To my surprise, everything was still in place. But my heart was racing and my cats were petrified. I was trying my best to rationalise that noise. Maybe it came from another apartment. But then, I got a phone call from my mum. She asked me if I was okay, as she had a weird feeling that something might be wrong. So, I told her what had happened just a minute before, and she told me to go over to her place ASAP. I put my cats in the car, which wasn't a very easy task as they were so afraid, and drove over to my mum's. I did go back there a few more times during the day just to finish packing, but I never stayed there overnight again. It's been several months now, and I've still not managed to rent it out or sell it. Mainly because I'm too afraid to spend too much time there, taking photos and such. The funny thing is, sometimes you tell people these stories, and people find it hard to believe that you'd stay in a place for so long believing that it might be haunted. But really, you just try your best to rationalise it as much as you can. And the activity happens intermittently, so it's easy to just brush it off as an isolated incident. Interestingly, I was clinically depressed whilst I was living in that apartment. I did make a lot of really bad choices back then. Nowadays, I wouldn't quite say my life is simple, as I permanently live in a different country. I have a partner and kids, and I work really hard so that I can come back to visit my family as often as possible. But, despite the difficulties, a cloud has definitely lifted, and life is good. I'm originally from California. My entire family resides in Los Angeles. For various reasons, we moved when I was about 2 years old to a small town in Texas. So, when I'm asked where I'm from, I like to flex. I'm Cali-made, Texas raised. Although some of my father's siblings made the move with us due to attractive employment opportunities, we still made frequent visits and often spent the majority of our summers on the West Coast. It was always an adventure every time we went down there to visit. Some of the most bizarre experiences that occurred in my young adult life from my summers down in Cali. Although there's one very memorable moment that always stands out to me and my cousins. It's one of our core memories that we all often discuss, and now, as adults, try to figure out. This happened one summer when I was about 11 or 12 years old. Me and my cousins spent most of our days outside our grandmother's house. She lived right next to an apartment complex in Lawndale, California. Being bored always seemed to be the beginning of many great adventures. On this particular afternoon, me and my cousins decided to play Charmed. It was a bunch of us girls that played witches with powers, and our boy cousins would play the demons. It sounds silly. It was a bit like tag, only we were in teams, and we all had make-believe powers. As we were playing, we looked up to see a little girl staring down at us. She had short curly blonde hair and was dressed in a nightgown. She was looking at us with an uneasy grin and what I can only describe as being a loud stare. She was standing near a rail on the 3rd floor. I say loud stare because at some point I felt uncomfortable and broke eye contact. Just then, I looked back and all my cousins were also staring up at this girl, with a glazed look on their face, almost mesmerised. It's important to note that I was the second oldest in a group of children aged between 6 and 12 years old. For some reason, it all just felt wrong, so I shouted up, "Hey!" and all my cousins turned and looked at me. I knew something was wrong, because none of them said a word. They were just kind of frozen, speechless. The apartment complex was open, and exposed to the outside. So, from my grandma's backyard, I could see up to the second and third floors, including all the doors that lead to the apartments. We must have turned around for a few seconds, and when we turned back, that girl was now on the second floor. Me and my older cousin shared a look of absolute despair. We both knew something was seriously amiss. But in that moment, we chose not to question how the girl had moved so quickly. We didn't want to scare the younger kids who seemingly hadn't noticed. She still had the same glazed and vacant expression on her face. Then, without breaking her grip, she shouted down to ask if she could play with us. Me and my older cousin both declined the girl's request to play, and for some reason, we both started cussing her out. It's also worth me mentioning that I'm Mexican American, and in our culture, we're all taught to curse bad spirits out. I think I speak for me and my cousin when I say we knew that there was something inhuman about that girl. And at this point, my younger cousins seemed frozen in fear. Immediately after we cussed that girl out, all of the lights in the street went dim for a second, before coming back on, and then going out completely. Blackouts are fairly common in Los Angeles, so it wasn't the first time we'd experienced one. But what happened next was unexplainable. When we looked back up at that building, the young girl was now walking across the utility pole cable like a tightrope. We watched her as she maintained perfect balance while walking across that cable without breaking eye contact with us. She carried on walking across that cable before seemingly fading away into the darkness. We never saw that little girl again. Spooked, we all ran back inside, and before long, the lights came back on. My grandmother has several friends that live in that apartment complex. None of the residents knew who that girl was or where she'd come from. She was simply never seen again. Please bear with me. I am in no way a writer, and I don't have that much experience with the paranormal, nor do I wish to. The following is my only real experience with the paranormal, and it took place a few years ago at my house, where I have lived since the end of 2011. The house belonged to my father in the 1980s, before he passed away. The only other questionable experience I've had was when my mother came to me in 2016. This was during a period where I was being irresponsible about the way I was living my life. I'm not even 100% sure whether it really happened or it was just a dream. But I won't get into that right now. So, in the summer of 2021, in the height of this whole COVID mess, I decided to build a garage/workshop at the bottom of my garden. I hired a mini digger to dig most of the footings out, ready for the concrete pour. I remember my son, who was almost 13 at the time, was helping me prepare the footings. When we were digging the trenches, my son came across some old ladies' cosmetics that were in surprisingly good condition, considering they'd been buried underground. I remember thinking this is a really odd thing to find, especially as I had lived in the house since 2011, and my father lived in the house before me since 1986. Anyway, I enlisted the help of a friend to help to pour and level out the concrete. After we'd finished work for the day, I quickly dropped him back to his place. I returned home to find my son mopping the kitchen and dining room. We had made quite a mess, going back and forth to the garden. I paused for a minute to take a moment to appreciate how much of a help he'd been all morning. It's usually quite a task just getting him off his Xbox. I said to him, "Shall we have a cup of tea and some leftover birthday cake?" as it had been my birthday a few days before. While we were waiting for the kettle to boil, we started eating the cake, and I joked about how big his slice was compared to mine. Suddenly, his face dropped, and his expression went from one of joy and laughter to one of complete shock and horror. He even spat out the cake that was in his mouth. He was looking towards the patio doors and the garden beyond. I turned around to observe what my son was looking at. Seeing nothing, I asked him what was wrong. He slowly raised his finger, pointing towards the open patio door. It was like he tried to speak, but couldn't. I said to him, "There's nothing there," at which point his face dropped even more. With his voice trembling, he then said, through tears of sheer terror, "It's gone upstairs." The stairway runs from the kitchen to the first floor. Almost immediately after, he started windmill punching what seemed to me like nothing but thin air. My mind was working overtime, trying to come up with answers and rationalise what was happening. All I could think to do was to pick my son up, carry him into the living room, place him on the sofa, and sit down next to him. He immediately, frantically, picked up the couch throw, placed it over his head, and sat there, uncontrollably sobbing. He would take it off momentarily every few seconds to check every corner of the room before placing it back over his face. At one point, he shouted, "It's right there in front of you," before placing it back over his head. Again, I couldn't see anything. He kept saying over and over again, "It's got no eyes, but it can see me." With the throw covering his head, he placed his hands over his ears and started shouting, "Shut up," repeatedly. I said to him, "I'm not saying anything," and he said, "I'm not talking to you." He then asked me where I was, because he could feel people sitting on either side of him. I confirmed that I was sat on his right hand side and held his hand. A few seconds later, he said, "It's got my leg," and my son's leg shot up in the air. I grabbed him by his waist, and it took all of my strength to keep hold of him. It was at this point that I was absolutely convinced my son was telling the truth, and there was something there that I just couldn't see. The jostling lasted for about 10 seconds before whatever had its grip on my son let go. I reached for the phone on the coffee table to call my older brother. He lives nearby, and he's the most religious member of our immediate family. As I picked the phone up, it felt like it was slapped out of my hand. It hit the floor and slid across to the other side of the room. I retrieved the phone and quickly made the call to my brother. I asked him to come round immediately and briefly explain what was going on. My son was still sat on the sofa, covering his face with that throw. He was still covering his ears with his hands, and repeatedly saying things like, "Please leave me alone, it's not true." As soon as I heard my brother's car pull up outside, my son pulled the throw down from his face and said with some relief, "It's going now, it's gone." After everything had calmed down, I asked my son what it was saying to him. He wouldn't tell me initially, but once I'd left the room, he told his uncle. Apparently, this thing was talking about me, saying that I was a bad father, and that I wasn't his real dad. This thing was telling my son that it was his real dad. Unsurprisingly, my son decided to spend the remainder of the evening at his mother's, who lives across the other side of town. Later that night, however, when I was lying in bed, I received an abundance of texts and calls from my son saying that this thing had followed him. He said he could hear it, and he sounded truly terrified on the phone. There wasn't really all that much I could do at the time, but try to reassure him. Me and his mother have been estranged for years now. I received some verbal abuse on the phone from his mother, as I was forced to call her to ask her to go upstairs to check on our son. I explained to her that he was calling me to ask me to help him in a situation where I just couldn't. Thankfully, after that, we haven't had any recurrences of whatever that was. Me and my son talked about it in the months that followed. However, as he's gotten older, he refuses to be drawn into conversation about it. I am convinced that we disturbed something supernatural while we were digging out those footings. I just hope to God that we've seen the last of it. Have you ever encountered anything like this? That wraps things up for today. If you have any thoughts on today's stories, or any suggestions for this channel, please leave them in the comments section down below. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.